Welcome, aquatic science students, to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center. We know you can't be here in person with us today, but we will do our best to make you feel like you are here and even like we're going down to the ponds to do some investigations. If you are watching this and you haven't registered yet, you can still do that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register to get yourself or your class registered for this field trip. We just use that information for our attendance purposes. Today's field trip is going to be about Earth systems, interactions, and aquatic environments. So during this virtual field trip, students will discover that aquatic environments are the product of Earth systems interactions. So we're going to give you an introduction to limnology. We're going to discuss how biological systems relate to aquatic environments, how geologic systems relate to aquatic environments, and how the hydrologic system relates to aquatic environments. And while we're doing all of that, you can ask us questions, but since this is a virtual field trip, you're going to do questions virtually also, and you're going to use a website that is www.tiny.cc/EEC-question-answer to ask us any questions you like about aquatic science, and as many questions as you like, and we will do our best to answer all of them in the time that we have with you this morning. So without further ado, we're going to have Mr. Monroe start us off with the introduction to limnology.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and I'm going to be doing a little segment of your virtual field trip today that deals with limnology. When we talk about limnology, that's a very special study about fresh water. And I'll tell you this, today's virtual field trip is that you're actually going to be doing an ecology-based program. That means we're going to be focusing on the study of the organisms and their interactions and relationships with their environment, which the organisms themselves, that's the biotic side, and the environment is made up of abiotic factors that some of the teachers that will be coming later will be talking about and showing you some things about. Okay, so the type of fresh water that we have out here at the Environmental Ed Center is called surface water. We do have some groundwater, that's water that is trapped in the ground, but we have two bodies of surface water here at the center, and it is a lentic type system, meaning when we use the word lentic, we're talking about water that is still, that is not moving. We have ponds behind the center that we study, and we have a lake in the Post Oak Preserve that we study. And because of recent conditions, there's not enough water in the pond for us to study, so we're going to do a field study on the lake that is located in the Post Oak Preserve. It's about a 12-acre lake, okay? Now, the other type of fresh water that we have around is called lotic water. And that's water that is moving, like creeks and streams and rivers. It's on the move all the time. Now, studying the biotic side of an environment, you know, if we were studying the Post Oak Preserve, the woods, the savanna that's across the road there that has nature trails in it, it would be pretty easy to study that environment. Simply, we could take hikes through that environment and make observations about everything that we encounter or that we see. It could go as far as looking at animal tracks, scat, which is the droppings that an animal might live, or actually seeing some of the organisms that live over there. Now, wildlife biologists, if they wanted to do a study on the biotic side of the Post Oak Preserve, basically, they might come through and do what we call line transects. They would stretch out a line maybe 50 meters long, and on that line, the meters are marked off. And once they do that, they would start recording all the evidence of life that they see on the ground, maybe a few inches below the ground in the leaf litter, all the way up to the canopies of the trees. And then they would compile all this information. I mean, all the evidence of life. They would compile it, and they would get a pretty good idea of what's living in that area. Not only would they do one site over there, they may have several transects scattered throughout the postal preserve. Now, in studying the lake or the pond, that can be a little difficult. Freshwater around here, it depends on what we call runoff. So the water's not actually real clear. And when we're doing this field study with students, we can walk around the pond or the lake, and man, some of those kids will see some of the organisms that live around the edge of the pond, or the lake, like frogs and even some algae, which is an organism. It's a plant-like organism, and all kinds of living things that would be around the edge. Dragonflies, dragonfly nymphs, all that kind of stuff. But as far as knowing what's in that water, it's a little different because that water's not clear and you can't see in it. So a lot of times students' imaginations will go to work. I've had students say, "Oh, Mr. Monroe, I don't want to get in there with the net and do any collecting because there might be alligators in there." Well, if there are alligators in there, I sure wouldn't want to put a student in there, right? So we always try to make it safe. Now, the sampling technique that we use to discover what biotic organisms or what organisms are thriving and being successful in that watery environment is using a collecting net called a seine. Now, I wish you guys were out here with us because you guys would be the ones that would be in the water with me. But instead, because we're on a virtual field trip today, the staff had to get into the water. And so we did collect a few things. Now, I want you guys to understand this. When we use that 20-foot seine, we are not fishing. That would be an illegal way to fish. We could be in trouble. But what we were doing, that is a sample technique that even biologists use when they want to find out what's in a watery environment. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is go ahead and turn it back over to Mr. Broughton so he can show you the video that we did while the staff did the sampling technique. Okay? Mr. Broughton, you got it.
All right, let me share my screen here and we'll get started with that video.
All these guys, these are sunfish. Green and blue sunfish. Out here all the same time. Then we got these hatchlings. That's a green sunfish. Then we got all these little guys here.
All right, so there we got to take a quick little visit to the hidden lake in the Post Oak Preserve and see the collection technique of seining. And so 2 questions came in while we were watching that. One was, can I go visit that lake? And yes, you can. That lake is part of the Post Oak Preserve, which is open to the public from sunrise to sunset. And then the other question was, what are those orange things on the net? And those orange things are kind of a styrofoam-like material that float to keep the top of that seining net from sinking into the water so that fish can't swim over the top and escape while you're seining. All right, now we're going to go on to biological systems and how they affect aquatic systems with Miss Nash.
Hello, welcome to my classroom. And you saw us out there at the pond. Okay, and hopefully someday soon you can come out and do that yourself. And the great thing, it was a beautiful day, it's kind of raining this week, but you may have seen me pulling out some of this stuff from our net. It's algae, and it's all over the pond this time of year in particular. Sometimes it covers the surface of all the ponds here. And there are lots of plants like that growing on the pond. One called duckweed, tiny floating ones. Ones that live right along, some in the water, some right along the edges, like the sedge, okay. Willow trees, okay. Special plants that are adapted to having really wet roots. Here's one of my favorites, from the edge, called frog fruit. Of course, frogs don't eat fruit, frogs eat insects, but because it's right on the edge, and I use sometimes people see froggies hopping around it, they call it frog fruit. Really a cute little. Now, we're talking about where the food chain starts. So we got the plants growing, and then we've got our microorganisms, little tiny things, and again, lots of tiny, tiny things in the pond. And if you come out, we can take samples and we can use a microscope and you can look at something. One of the really cool ones I thought was the dragonfly larvae. So the dragonflies, you see them out there laying their eggs in the water, and then the nymph, the big thing, and it's a kind of a voracious predator right there. And we often catch those, not this time. But there's lots of things living in the water itself. And that's where our food chain starts. So now, there. Sorry, it makes so much noise I forgot to turn it off again. Here's those little fish that we caught. You saw us catching them. Oh, they are. I have an aerator in there. Fish, of course, get their oxygen from the water itself. So you have to get a little bit of water, of air in there, aerated, so they can survive. But these are our little sunfish, and they eat little tiny critters in the water, and then other bigger fish will be eating them. So we have crappie, we've got bass, we've got the carp, we've got all kinds of other bigger fish in there that will be eating them. Other animals that might eat them, not today, of course, would be our friend here, the turtle. Let me get it. This is one that you may see along the edge of that pond, sitting on a log, and they'll slide into the water when they see you coming. That's why we call him the slider. He's pretty green. He's got great camouflage for that algae-covered water and the mossy log. You can see the red mark on the head, gives them their name, red-eared slider. So he's an omnivore. He'll also eat the roots of the plants growing along the edges, the cattails, those big cattails. They like those, arrowroot, some of the others. But he also likes to catch fish and insects when he can. I'll put him back in the water. And another little predator we have out there is our froggy. And I've got him covered up because he went so crazy in here because he didn't like to be in a tiny cage like this. I thought he'd hurt himself. It's a leopard frog, and He's got those big bug eyes. He can just sit there in the water, just those eyes above the water to grab insects. First, they lay their eggs in the water. The tadpoles live in the water, and it's an amphibian, a double life. And those tadpoles are a favorite fruit of my next friends here. Here's the skin you might find along the edge of a lake. See that? Even the head is right there. Okay. So it's a shed skin of one of our native snakes. This is a ribbon snake, often called a garter snake. And I'm not going to attempt to handle this one because every time I do, I have to go chasing it all around. There's a little baby ribbon snake. Okay. And they're very pretty. They're stripy. They love tadpoles and tiny fish. And they're in the water. They're great swimmers. You think a snake can't swim, but actually they're great swimmers. A little ribbon snake. So pretty. Now, who might like to eat more fish? That would be the egret. This is a snowy egret, a mounted one. But we see them a lot. And they've got that long beak to grab fish, little frogs, tadpoles, big insects, long neck to reach way out, and those extraordinary legs to wade into the water. And the feet, look at those feet. And they can walk on the mud. The sink, like a snowshoe, distributes their weight. So really, we saw a great egret last week when we were out there. But we also noticed in our great blue heron, our biggest one, and often we see little sandpipers like this. So sandpiper, it's got playing a flute or a pipe, and again got those big feet for walking in the mud, and that long beak for sticking down into the mud to get little critters out of. Other things you might look for when you're walking on the side of the lake are things like these shells. These are freshwater mussels. They're in the pond, and they're filter feeders. They're going to be filtering out lots of little microorganisms. And somebody could come along and someone ate the animal from the inside. And I bet it was someone with clever hands. You can find these tracks all along the edge of the pond when the water level is down. Okay, and a raccoon with clever hands to open up that mussel and eat it. Another thing to look for is signs of other animals. A beaver chewed log. You think, oh, but I didn't see a beaver lodge, Miss Nash. Well, we don't have a lodge here in this part of the world where the water doesn't freeze. Beavers don't make that big house. They just burrow into the bank. But look how they chewed the bark off that tree and cut it down with those rodent teeth. And you can find, they're big, they're like 40 pounds, largest rodent in North America. And there's a track you can look for. So if you go down to the post-up reserve, take your binoculars, okay, and look for birds, walk around and look for tracks, see what you can find, what evidence of life. I have one more thing. Oh, here's something else you might find. It's called a chimney. There was no house down there burning wood. It's a crawdad burrow, and they're in the water, and they're also burrowing down into the mud. And you might find this, and it lets you know they're there. So that's all I have, and Mr. Broughton can answer any questions. Thank you, and we hope to see you out here hiking those trails.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. We got two questions. The first one is, are all of those animals really there at the pond? And yes, they are. We have a pretty amazing forest and freshwater ecosystem in that post oak preserve. And the other question is, do all fish need air to breathe? And fish they breathe oxygen from the water. Not all fish need the same amount of oxygen, though. One example is that a catfish can survive in lower levels of oxygen than other fish. All right, now we're going to move on to geologic systems and how they affect aquatic systems.
Good morning, students. Today we're going to look at how does the geology of a region affect its freshwater bodies. And the conditions that affect lake ecosystems are very similar to the things that affect marine ecosystems. Light penetration, temperature, pH, the depth of the water. So how does the geology of the area affect these different things? Well, let's start with soil. I'm going to show you a sample. This is the soil for our ecoregion. It's called Houston Black, and it happens to be the Texas state soil. Houston Black is very gummy. It has a very high clay content. I'll show you a little piece of it. It just kind of sticks together. Can you see how that stuck together? So Houston Black is a high clay content soil. Now, the good part of that for the pond is it can seal the pond and keep it from leaking water, especially if you're in an area with a lot of sand. But clay particles are extremely tiny, and they can get suspended in the water and block the sunlight. Now, you know, you've got to have sunlight in order for photosynthesis to take place. So that can affect the amount of photosynthesis that's going on in the lake if the lake gets too turbid or too cloudy. Another thing would be silt. Silt is also very small. It's not as small. The silt particles are not as small as the clay particles. Silt particles are very similar to the consistency of powder, like the powder your mother puts on her face or the powder you put on a baby. Clay particles are smaller than that. But all of those things can contribute to the turbidity or ness of the water. That can also affect the pH. Now, our soils here, because we're based on a limestone substrata, generally are alkaline and can affect the pH of the water. As you know, rain is slightly acidic, 5.5 pH, and with this slightly alkaline soil, it can neutralize the water, so the water can have a pH of about 7. So that's good. Now, some of the other things that we see reflected here are the substrata, those layers underneath the water, and those can hold different kinds of aquifers. An aquifer is a water-bearing strata. It can be made of limestone. It can be made of, they can come to the surface as springs. Sometimes they're gravity fed, sometimes they're artesian springs where they just push up. I'm going to bring a couple to mind. You may have gone swimming in West Texas at Balmorhea. Balmorhea is a man-made water reservoir. It's very small. But it has a huge amount of spring water that flows through it from the San Solomon Springs, somewhere between 15 million to 22 million gallons of spring water per day. Now, that's sort of mind-boggling. That's a tremendous amount of water, but it's very clean and very pure. It doesn't have to be chlorinated. It's so pure, and that underlying strata provides the water for Balmorhea. Now, we only have one natural lake in the whole state. That's Caddo Lake over there in East Texas. All the other lakes you see around, they're surface water. They're on the surface, and they're man-made. Things like all these reservoirs we have around Dallas that supply the drinking water for Dallas, those are all man-made lakes. They're not natural. Now, another spring-fed lake would be the little lake in San Marcos outside of Texas State University. It's fed from the San Marcos Springs. It was dammed up to form a little lake in 1848 for a mill. But we use it for recreation and also education now. That water is probably the purest water in the state in a surface water reservoir. And it's the home to some endangered species, very delicate endangered species like the Texas blind salamander. So that's an important thing. This water gushes out of the Edwards Aquifer, which is a rechargeable aquifer. Some aquifers like the Ogallala in the Panhandle recharge extremely slowly, if at all. But the Edwards can recharge in 3 days if they have a tremendous amount of rain. Now, I'm going to stop talking about geology itself, and I'm going to talk about geology as a profession. It's a very good career. It pays well. You can make about $90,000 to $100,000 a year with a bachelor's degree. If you have advanced degrees, you can make up to $150,000, even $200,000 a year. It's a very interesting. Different careers in geology would include environmental geology, geosciences, pollution control, glacial geology, geological surveying, water supply, engineering geology, volcanology, geochemistry. So it's got a wide variety of things. If you like working outdoors, if you like working with rocks, if you like learning about fossils. Of course, when you say geology in Texas, everyone automatically thinks of the oil field. But the oil field's not the only place where geologists work, and they do work a lot with water. And I'm going to tell you the top 5 schools in Texas for geology. First one's Rice University in Houston, University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M University in Bryan College Station, University of Texas at Dallas. It's in Richardson, actually, and SMU right here in Dallas. So there are a world of interesting things that you can learn and make money at in geology. I'm going to turn any questions you have over to Mr. Broughton. He'd be glad to answer them for you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. And the question that we got is, how many aquifers are in Texas? So I'm going to share my screen with you to show you a map of the aquifers of Texas. So there are 9 major aquifers in the state of Texas. There's the Gulf Coast, the Edwards Trinity, the Waco Mesilla Bolson, Pecos Valley, Ogallala, Seymour, Trinity, and Carrizo Wilcox aquifers. And our aquifer here in Dallas would be the Trinity Aquifer. I'm sure you're familiar with the Trinity River. And now we're going to move on to the hydrologic cycle and how that affects aquatic environments.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about the hydrological cycle, or also known as the water cycle. So the water cycle just describes the continuous movement of water on, above, and below the Earth's surface. And again, that's the hydrologic cycle. So let's look at this diagram behind me. Can y'all identify any parts or steps of the water cycle? So water is always changing states from a solid to a liquid to a gas. For today's purpose, we're going to start with evaporation. Now, technically, there is no starting point to the water cycle, but for today, we're just going to start with evaporation. So if we look on our diagram, where do you think evaporation is indicated? So evaporation would take place here, and all evaporation is when the sun's energy heats up water droplets in ponds and lakes, and it causes that liquid water to turn into water vapor and go up into the atmosphere. So on our diagram, evaporation would be represented right here. We can also experience a form of evaporation called transpiration, and that would be evident here on this diagram. So plants also release or lose water as well. So transpiration can be indicated on this point right here on the diagram. Now, once that water turns into water vapor and enters into the atmosphere, that water vapor is going to cool down in the atmosphere. Eventually, under the right conditions, all of those water vapor droplets will condense or clump together in what we call condensation. So again, condensation is just that transformation of that water vapor clumping together to form our clouds. Once that atmosphere is saturated and can't hold any more of that water vapor, droplets will then be released and fall as precipitation. So if we look on our diagram, where would condensation and precipitation be located? So condensation would be here. Whoops, there it goes. And precipitation would be over here. And what are the main steps of what are the main types of precipitation? We have rain, snow, sleet, and hail. And one of the tools that we can use to measure the amount of precipitation is to use a rain gauge, which we see right here. Now, luckily, we've had quite a bit of rain lately, so I would imagine we would have quite a bit of rain in our rain gauge. Now, again, once that precipitation hits the ground, then we have what's known as runoff, and that runoff can enter our watersheds. So when the precipitation hits the ground, it can either run off due to gravity, making it go downward, and it can enter our waterways, or it can soak into the ground through infiltration, and it can enter our groundwater system. Now, I use the word watershed. So a watershed is simply a network of all the ponds, lakes, streams, and rivers that are kind of leading into a larger body of water. So to give you a better example of what a watershed is, we're going to use a model of an umbrella. So here's my umbrella, and we're just going to imagine that all of these blue segments are areas of water or bodies of water. Now imagine it rains, or if I were to dump water, all of that water is going to move where? In what direction? It's going to move down. So let's take our ponds, for example. We have two ponds out behind us. Our big pond is our biggest body of water that we have that's further back. What ends up happening with our big pond, when we get a lot of rain and flooding, our big pond, that water will run off and merge with the small pond that's right behind me. So that would be an example of a watershed. Now, a lot of students often ask, sometimes that big pond during times of drought, when we get very little rain, sometimes that big pond will be completely dry. And then all of a sudden we'll have weeks of rain and that pond will fill up again. Students are surprised to find out that there are fish in that big pond. Now, we don't stock the pond, so how do you think those fish ended up there if there were none there to begin with? Well, the watershed, when it floods, it's a great highway for fish to travel through. So when we get a lot of rainwater and flooding that occurs, there's another pond that's further back, not even on our property. When that pond floods, it will run off. So fish will travel through that runoff. Also, unfortunately, trash will travel with that runoff, and it will eventually make its way to our big pond. Then when our big pond floods, some fish, other organisms, unfortunately some trash from watersheds up above will eventually end up in our smaller pond. So a watershed demonstrates how all of these bodies of water in a particular area are connected. So I'm going to switch my screen really quick so that I can show you a couple of things. The first thing I want to show you guys is a watershed viewer so that you can figure out what watershed you're in. So let me share my screen. And let's take a look at our watershed viewer. This happens to be for where we're located right now in Seagoville. And you can see we're right here. You can see all of these bodies of water that we're near. And then you can see that we are in the sub-watershed of the Hickory Creek Parsons Slough. And that's where we are here. So this is a fun little thing from Texas Parks and Wildlife. You can put in your address and see what watershed you're a part of and what other bodies of water are near you. So even though your community might be doing an awesome job with cleaning up all the pollution and making sure that y'all are doing the right thing for the environment, if there's a community that's just north of you whose waterways are heavily polluted, when we get runoff, their pollution will eventually affect y'all's a body of water. So a watershed is just showing us how all these bodies of water are interconnected. The next thing I want to show you are just a couple of videos from our pond. So I'm gonna play that really quick. Make your observations. So if you have a science journal, grab your science journal or paper and pencil and write down your observations that you're seeing right now. The birds that you're seeing are ibises. This is an after picture. So where do you think all that water went? What part of the water cycle are you observing right now? When our pond was completely evaporated. So now I'm going to stop sharing our screen, and I have a reflection question for you guys. So I want y'all to think about what y'all saw in that video. So I want y'all to, hopefully while you were watching the video, you either remember or you had some paper that you could jot down your observations. Record your observations that you saw. So what are some things that you saw in the video or in the pictures? And then describe the steps of the water cycle as it pertains to the video and the pictures that you saw. I also want you to think about, how does drought affect biotic elements? And just a reminder, biotic elements are your living elements in an ecosystem. So how do you think our living organisms were affected by the water cycle or processes that you saw in the video or in the pictures? And just to follow up with that, I collected some things. Once all that water dried out, we were able to walk across that entire area, and there was a lot of cool things that we found. So here we have a carp skeleton. There were lots of skeletons of fish. So here's this cool one. You can see the beautiful scales. You can see its vertebrate or its backbone. These really are beautiful fish when they're alive. They look cool as a skeleton as well. And then we also have the shell of a red-eared slider. And you can see how their body shape is nice and flattened to make them streamlined so that they can swim through the water. And then also one last thing, these are some aquatic insects. So what do you think happened to the fish, the turtles, the insects that depend on the pond ecosystem for their habitat? So think about what happened to those organisms as you're writing in your journals. And for those that love insects and love studying them, a career option for you guys would be entomology. And Texas A&M is a wonderful school that offers a degree in entomology, which is the study of insects. So these are some cool insects that we have in our pond ecosystem. So just a quick recap. Today we observed changes that happened in our pond using the videos and the photos. So we made some observations. We also discussed some science tools. We talked about the rain gauge, which is used to collect and measure the amount of precipitation. The temperature with our thermometer is important because the hotter it is, the more evaporation is going to take place. And something I forgot to mention, we can actually use a science tool like a meter stick. If you want to determine the water level, something super easy is just to stick a meter stick in the pond to see how high that water is or the water depth. If you have a really deep pond, a lot of people will go out in a canoe or a kayak and stick a weighted rope down into the water. And then when you pull it out, you just use a measuring tape or a measuring stick to measure the water depth. And that is all I have for you guys today about the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. We're going to pass it back to Mr. Broughton, and he's going to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. The question that came in is, what other careers are there related to aquatic science? And there are many, many careers related to water management, and aquatic science. In fact, I attended a couple workshops last year, and the presenters both said there are many job openings right now in the state of Texas for those types of careers. So two that I will mention specifically, since I think they have to do with what we discussed during today's virtual field trip, are a hydrologist. And that is someone who studies the movement, distribution, and quality of water. And another career would be a freshwater stream ecologist or river ecologist. They study animal and plant life in Texas's stream and rivers. So those are two pretty interesting careers that are available as well. Now I'm going to share my screen here to do a quick recap of what we did today. There we go. So today, during this virtual field trip, you discovered that aquatic environments are the product of Earth systems interactions. So you saw an introduction to limnology. We discussed how biological systems relate to aquatic environments, how geologic systems relate to aquatic environments, and how the hydrologic system relates to aquatic environments. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This was our first aquatic science virtual field trip. So we would like your feedback on how we did. You can give us that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback. Let us know what you thought about today's field trip. We value your input and use that to improve what we do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and wish you a great rest of your morning. Bye-bye.